In the late spring of 1974, inside the sun-bleached walls of the Black Hawk County Seed Co-op, a silence fell that was heavy enough to hear. It wasn't the silence of respect, but the kind of quiet that precedes a landslide of laughter. Silas Thorne, a man whose face was etched with as many lines as a topographical map of the Iowa River bluffs, stood at the wooden counter with a small burlap sack. Behind the counter stood Arthur Vance, a man in a crisp, short-sleeved shirt who sold progress by the bushel and high-yield dreams by the bag. "You're serious, Silas?" Arthur asked, his voice echoing off the stacks of AAA hybrid yellow corn that reached toward the rafters like green and gold monuments to the future. "You're passing up the most advanced genetics in the history of the Midwest for, what did you call those? Iron pod pole beans and blue flint corn," Silas said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "They're heirloom. My grandfather gathered the originals from a traveler who'd been through the mountains long before the first John Deere plow ever tasted this dirt." Arthur leaned over the counter, his gold watch catching the fluorescent light. "Silas, it's 1974. We've got men on the moon, and we've got chemical companies creating seeds that can grow on a sidewalk if you give them enough anhydrous ammonia." He gestured to the warehouse. "Every farmer from here to the Missouri border is planting hybrids. They're looking at 200 bushels an acre. They're buying new trucks and leveraging their land to buy more land because the world is hungry, and the bank is handing out money like it's candy." Silas didn't look at the stacks of shiny uniform seed bags. He looked at the dirt under his own fingernails. He was a man who still drove a 1958 pickup and wore a Carhartt jacket that had been patched more times than a local highway. He wasn't interested in the great expansion. He was interested in the truth. "Those hybrids are built for a sprint, Arthur," Silas said quietly. "They need a perfect world. They need the rain to fall on schedule and the chemicals to arrive on time. But these beans, they're built for a marathon. They've seen the droughts of the 1930s and the blights of the 1950s. They remember how to survive when the supply lines break." The laughter started then. It began with a snicker from a young farmer named Miller, who was waiting to load 40 bags of hybrid seed into his new flatbed. Soon, the whole co-op was joined in a chorus of mockery. "Hey, Silas, you going to hunt your dinner with a bow and arrow too?" someone shouted. "That dead ground of yours won't grow beans even if they are magic," another added, referring to Silas's rocky, sloping 40 acres on the edge of the county. "You're throwing your future away for a handful of colorful pebbles," Arthur said, shaking his head with a mixture of pity and contempt. They called him the Seed Hunter, but they didn't mean it as a compliment. To the men in Black Hawk County, Silas was a relic, a man afraid of the future, clinging to the Stone Age of agriculture. While everyone else was skyrocketing toward prosperity, Silas Thorne didn't argue. He'd learned a long time ago that you can't talk a man out of a belief he didn't use logic to get into. He simply paid for his supplies in cash, no loans, no interest, no debt, and carried his small burlap bag out to his truck. He drove past fields that were being prepared with massive 8-row planters and heavy applications of synthetic fertilizer. The soil in those fields was being vined and mined, pushed to produce more than it was ever meant to, fueled by the intoxicating promise of record-high grain prices and easy credit. When Silas reached his farm, he didn't see dead ground. He saw a complex, living system that had been forgotten. For decades, the local agricultural university had been preaching the new orthodoxy: one crop, one field, and a total reliance on the chemical juggernaut. They called it efficiency. Silas called it a trap. He walked out to his western slope, where the wind from the plains hit the hardest. He knelt in the dirt and opened his hand. The beans weren't the uniform, pale yellow of the modern varieties. They were mottled with purple, black, and deep ochre seeds that carried the genetic memory of 1,000 years. He knew that for the next few years, his neighbors would outproduce him. They would bring in thousands of bushels of yellow corn while he struggled with low yields and manual labor. But Silas Thorne had a secret, one he'd found buried in a leather-bound journal in a root cellar long ago. He wasn't farming for the harvest of 1975. He was farming for the day the music stopped. He was preparing for the moment when the supply lines Arthur Vance loved so much would stretch until they snapped, and the perfect world of the hybrids would come crashing down into the dust. As the sun set over the Iowa bluffs, Silas began to plant. He didn't use a multi-row planter. He used his hands, placing the seeds in mounds the way the three sisters had been planted for a millennium corn to provide the ladder, and beans to provide the life. To the world, he was a fool. To the land, he was the only one who was listening. The secret didn't live in the light of the morning or the shiny brochures of the seed dealers. It lived in the damp, cool darkness of what the Thorne family called the Iron Cellar. It was a small, stone-lined room buried deep beneath the foundation of the original 1888 homestead, accessible only by a heavy oak door that groaned like a restless ghost when opened. Silas had known the cellar was there his whole life, but like many sons of the soil, he hadn't bothered to look deeply into the past while he was busy fighting the present. Farming in the 1950s and 60s didn't leave much room for nostalgia. It was in the winter of 1962, shortly after his father, Silas Sr., had passed away, that Silas finally descended those stone steps with a flickering lantern. He was looking for a leak in the plumbing, but what he found was a legacy. Tucked away in the furthest corner, beneath a stack of rusted tools and moth-eaten horse blankets, sat a heavy cedar trunk reinforced with iron bands. Inside was a collection of artifacts from a life he'd never truly known. Old photographs of stern-faced men in wool suits, a pocket watch that had long since surrendered to time, and at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from the creeping moisture of the earth, a leather-bound journal. Silas sat on the cold stone floor and opened the book. The handwriting was precise, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. It belonged to his grandfather, Elijah Thorne, a man who had survived the land rush, the First World War, and the apocalyptic years of the 1930s. Elijah hadn't written about his feelings or his daily chores. He had written a manual for survival. The journal was a record of 50 years of working the Iowa bluffs, a catalogue of every mistake paid for in sweat and every lesson learned in tears. And at the end of the journal, on a page dated November 1945, Elijah had left a warning that felt like a cold hand on Silas's shoulder. The soil has a memory, and the weather has a cycle. The fat years are a mask that hides the hungry years to come. When the rain stops and the earth tires, the new seeds will fail because they have no history. Remember the iron pod and the blue flint. They have survived 1,000 years of wind and fire. Plant them before the crisis comes, not after. After is too late. Behind the journal, tucked into a hidden compartment of the trunk, Silas found the seeds. They were the 1,000-year-old grain Elijah had written about. There were the iron pod beans, so hard and dark they looked like polished river stones, and the blue flint corn, with kernels the color of a midnight sky. These weren't the AAA hybrids Arthur Vance was hawking at the co-op. These were the biological blueprints of an ancient resilience. Silas spent 3 hours in that cellar, reading by the dying light of his lantern. He read about the Dust Bowl years, when Elijah watched his neighbors pack their cars and head for California because their wheat had died in the dry earth. He read how Elijah had stayed behind and planted these very seeds crops that didn't need a perfect world to grow. These plants had deep roots, reaching down 6 feet or more to find moisture where other crops found only despair. But more importantly, Silas learned the science of the 3 sisters. Elijah had described how the beans were the life-givers, hosting invisible bacteria on their roots that could pull nitrogen directly out of the thin air and turn it into food for the corn. It was a symbiotic dance that had been performed for a millennium before the first chemical factory was ever built. While the modern farmers were beginning to rely on expensive bags of synthetic fertilizer, Silas realized that Elijah had been growing his own fertilizer for free. When Silas finally climbed out of that cellar, he was a different man. He looked at his 40 acres of rocky ground and didn't see dead ground, as the county extension agent called it. He saw a battlefield where he was going to take a stand against the new orthodoxy of monoculture and debt. For the next 10 years, Silas operated in the shadows. While his neighbors were busy leveraging their land to buy the latest John Deere 4020 tractors and pouring thousands of gallons of anhydrous ammonia into their soil, Silas was quietly multiplying his heirloom seeds. He planted small plots in the hidden drawers of his property, away from the prying eyes of men like Roy Dennison and Arthur Vance. He watched as the great expansion of the 1970s took hold of the county. He saw farmers who had been cautious their whole lives suddenly find themselves sitting on what looked like gold mines as land prices tripled. The bankers and the dealers were all singing the same song: expand, borrow, buy more, use more. They promised that the high-yield hybrids were the only way to feed the world. Silas didn't buy the new equipment. He kept his old 1958 pickup and his father's hand tools. He didn't take out a single loan. Every month, instead of paying interest to the bank, he put a few $100s into a savings account at the Jessup State Bank. His neighbors laughed at him over coffee at the diner. "Hey Silas," Roy Dennison would say, I saw you out there with a hoe yesterday. My new 8-row planter could do your whole farm in 20 minutes. Why are you living in the past? Silas would just smile and think of the journal in the iron cellar. I'm not living in the past, Roy, he would say. I'm just making sure I have a future. By 1974, Silas had enough of the iron pod beans and blue flint corn to plant his entire western slope, the rocky, wind-swept ground that everyone else had given up on. He knew that the hybrids his neighbors were planting were sprint crops. They were bred for speed and volume, but they had no stamina. They were built for a world where the rain always fell and the chemicals were always cheap. But Elijah's journal had warned him. The rain doesn't know what year it is, and the wind doesn't read the newspapers. Silas knew that the perfect world of the 1970s was a fragile illusion. Beneath the surface of those lush, green hybrid fields, the soil was getting tired. The heavy equipment was compacting the earth, and the constant chemical applications were killing the microscopic life that made the soil a living thing. Silas knelt on his western slope and pushed an iron pod bean into the red dirt. He wasn't just planting a crop, he was planting 1,000 years of wisdom. He was the seed hunter, and he was waiting for the moment the world would realize that the old ways were the only ways that worked when the music finally stopped. The midsummer sun of 1975 was a relentless, brassy weight that pressed down on the Iowa bluffs, baking the gravel roads into a fine, white powder. In the fields of Black Hawk County, the great expansion was in full bloom. From the cab of his 1958 truck, Silas watched the emerald sea of hybrid corn that stretched to the horizon. It was beautiful, in a surgical, uniform way. Every stalk was the same height, every leaf the same shade of laboratory green. But Silas knew that beauty was a mask. He was sitting in his kitchen, cleaning a handful of iron pod beans, when a dusty black sedan with state government plates pulled into his driveway. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd been ironed more carefully than his own shirts. This was Professor Harrison Reed, a high-ranking agricultural scientist from the State University and one of the primary architects of the Green Revolution in the Midwest. He was a man who believed that the secrets of the universe were written in chemical formulas, not in the dirt under a farmer's fingernails. Reed didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight to the edge of Silas's western slope, where the blue flint corn stood tall, its stalks thick and dark, with the iron pod beans winding upward in a tight, purple-mottled embrace. "Mr. Thorne," Reed said, his voice clipped and academic, "I've heard the stories about your project. I had to see it for myself before I wrote my final report on the county's conservation efforts." "And what do you see, Professor?" Silas asked, leaning against the porch rail. "I see a genetic fossil," Reed replied, gesturing dismissively at the field. "I see biological failure disguised as tradition. Those seeds you're planting, these heirlooms, are obsolete. They've been surpassed by 30 years of rigorous laboratory breeding. Your yields will be 40% lower than your neighbors, and your labor costs will be double. In the world of modern agriculture, you are essentially trying to win a drag race with a horse and buggy." Silas walked down to meet him. "I'm not trying to win a race, Professor. I'm trying to keep the land alive." Reed laughed, a dry, intellectual sound. "The land isn't a person, Silas. It's a medium. It's a factory floor. We provide the inputs, the hybrid genetics, the synthetic nitrogen, the chemical pesticides, and the land provides the output. It's a closed-loop system of efficiency. What you're doing with these beans, this companion planting, it's a fairy tale from a pre-industrial era. Science has rendered these three sisters techniques unnecessary. Why bother with nitrogen-fixing bacteria when we can inject pure anhydrous ammonia directly into the soil?" Silas knelt and scooped up a handful of his own dirt. It was dark, crumbly, and smelled like a forest floor after a rain. "Because your factory floor is dying, Professor. Have you walked Roy Dennison's field lately?" "Roy Dennison is a model farmer," Reed snapped. "He's hitting record yields. He's mining the soil, not farming it," Silas said firmly. "Walk with me." They crossed the fence line to Roy's property. The transition was jarring. Underneath the towering hybrid corn, the soil was a pale, lifeless gray. It was hard-packed, cracked like a desert floor, and dusty. There was no smell of life, only the faint, metallic tang of chemical residue. Silas took a small spade and turned over a clod of Roy's earth. It came up in a heavy, solid chunk that wouldn't break apart. "Look at this," Silas said. "No earthworms, no root channels. The soil biology is gone. You've killed the microbial life with constant chemical applications, and heavy machinery that compacts the earth until it can't breathe. This soil isn't a factory floor, it's a corpse on life support. Reed adjusted his glasses, looking uncomfortable. Soil structure is a secondary concern. As long as the chemical inputs are maintained, the yield will remain high. We have the technology to override the soil's natural limitations. You're cheating nature, Professor, and nature always collects its debts, Silas replied. He pointed to the horizon. When the wind picks up, this soil blows away because there's no organic matter left to hold it together. It takes nature 500 years to build 1 inch of topsoil, but your modern methods can let the wind take it in 5. You're trading 1,000 years of history for 10 years of profit. Silas led him back to his own field and dug a hole near one of the corn mounds. The soil was full of tiny white nodules clinging to the bean roots. Those are the life givers, Silas explained, the rhizobium bacteria. They pull nitrogen from the air and give it to the corn for free. In return, the corn provides a ladder for the beans to reach the sun. They aren't competing, they're cooperating. And look at the earthworms. He pointed to a dozen fat, red worms wriggling in the dark loam. In my soil, the earthworm count is over 20 per cubic foot. In Roy's, I couldn't find 2. These worms are my plows. They create channels for water and air to reach deep into the subsoil. When the August heat hits, my corn won't roll its leaves because my soil functions like a sponge, holding every drop of moisture. Roy's soil is like concrete. The rain just runs off and takes more topsoil with it. Reed looked at the samples Silas had collected 7 years of data he'd recorded in his own version of his grandfather's journal. He saw the organic matter levels rising from 1.2% to nearly 4%. He saw the water infiltration rates increasing by over 300%. For a moment, the professor's academic certainty wavered. He saw a man who had bought the dead ground for $185 an acre and was building it into something richer than the $3,000 ground next door. But Reed was a man of the system. He couldn't admit that the new orthodoxy was flawed without admitting his own life's work was a mistake. It's an interesting hobby, Silas, Reed said, brushing the dirt from his trousers. But it's not scalable. You can't feed the world with a hoe and a handful of purple beans. Without the hybrids and the chemicals, we'd have mass starvation. Your seed hunter philosophy is a luxury for the few, not a solution for the many. You'll be bankrupt within 3 years, caught between low yields and high labor. My warning to you is simple. Get with the times, or the times will bury you. I'd rather be buried in healthy soil than live on a dying one, Silas said quietly. The professor drove away in his black sedan, leaving a cloud of white dust that hung in the air for a long time. Silas watched him go, then turned back to his field. He looked at the blue flint corn and the iron pod beans. He knew that the neighbors were already laughing about the professor's visit at the feed store. They thought Silas had been lectured by the ultimate authority. But Silas Thorne knew that the ultimate authority wasn't a man with a degree. It was the land itself. He could feel the soil beneath his boots, cool and moist, full of the invisible, teeming life that his grandfather had written about. He knew that the factory floor next door was exhausted, its biology tired and its margins thinning as the cost of chemicals and debt began to climb. He remembered the words from the journal in the iron cellar. The drought will come again. It always does. Plant the seeds that remember the dry years before the dry years arrive. Silas looked at his western slope and whispered a silent thank you to the seed hunter who had come before him. He was ready. He was patient. And he knew that the cheating Reed spoke of was about to meet a very harsh reckoning. The winter of 1979 was dry, but it was the financial chill that truly froze the hearts of the farmers in Black Hawk County. For years, the bankers and the seed dealers had promised that the great expansion would never end. But in October of that year, the music stopped. Interest rates began a vertical climb that would eventually hit 21.5%, turning every equipment loan and land mortgage into a ticking time bomb. Then, in January of 1980, the grain embargo against the Soviet Union caused export markets to collapse. Corn prices that had been the pride of the Midwest plummeted from $3.56 a bushel to a staggering $2.22. But as the spring of 1980 arrived, the economic crisis was joined by a biological one. The new orthodoxy of farming had created a landscape of genetic clones. Every field from the river bluffs to the county line was planted with the same high-yield hybrids, all designed to perform in a perfect world of abundant rain and cheap chemicals. They were fast, they were uniform, and they were fragile. Silas Thorne watched from his western slope as the weather turned brutal. June brought a heat wave that didn't break for weeks, with temperatures regularly soaring over 100 degrees. The drought of 1980 was a relentless, thirsty ghost that haunted the plains, but it brought a companion even more terrifying: the Great Blight. Because the modern hybrids were built on such a narrow genetic base, they lacked the immune system of the ancient grains. A fungal pathogen, thriving in the extreme heat, began to sweep through the county. It attacked the leaves of the hybrid corn, turning the emerald green factory floors into brittle brown graveyards in a matter of days. Roy Dennison's field, once the envy of the co-op, was the first to fall. His AAA hybrids, which required massive amounts of water to maintain their laboratory speed, began to wither. The stalks, weakened by the blight and the lack of moisture, simply fell over, too frail to stand. Because Roy had mined his soil of organic matter and compacted it with heavy iron, the earth was like concrete. When a rare, sparse rain did fall, it didn't soak in. It simply ran off the hard surface, taking more of the precious topsoil with it. Silas Thorne's 40 acres, however, told a different story. The blue flint corn was stressed, its leaves curled tight during the heat of the day. To conserve moisture it was alive. The iron pod beans were the secret weapon. Their deep roots, reaching down over 6 feet, were finding moisture in the subsoil that the hybrid roots could never reach. But more importantly, the beans were still feeding the corn. While Roy Dennison was watching his crops starve because he couldn't afford the skyrocketing cost of synthetic nitrogen, Silas's corn was receiving a steady, free supply of life from the bacteria clinging to the bean roots. In mid-July, Roy Dennison drove his truck to the edge of Silas's property. He didn't come to mock the seed hunter this time. He stood by the stone wall and stared at the dark green stalks of the blue flint. Roy looked like a man who had seen his world collapse and didn't know how to rebuild it. "How is it still standing, Silas?" Roy asked, his voice thick with the dust of his own dying fields. "I've poured every chemical the university recommended into my ground. I've used the best seeds money can buy, and my corn looks like it's been through a fire. Yours is still breathing." Silas walked to the fence line, a single iron pod bean pod in his hand. "It's not magic, Roy. It's memory. These seeds have survived the droughts of 1,000 years. They know how to slow down when the water runs out. They know how to work together. Your hybrids are like thoroughbred horses. They can run fast on a groomed track, but they don't know what to do when the track turns to mud." He knelt and dug into the soil at Roy's feet. It was hot, dry, and lifeless. Then he stepped back onto his own land and dug a handful of dirt from beneath the shade of a corn mound. It was cool to the touch. "This is the difference, Roy," Silas said, holding out the dark, moist loam. "My soil is a sponge. Because I didn't kill the biology with chemicals, the mycorrhizal fungi are still down there, acting like an extension of the root system, bringing water and minerals from deep in the earth. Your soil is a tomb. The factory floor you were so proud of only works if the manager, the chemical company, keeps the power on. But when the price of power goes up and the rain stops, the factory shuts down." Roy was quiet for a long time, watching the wind move through the purple mottled beans. "Arthur Vance says you're just lucky. Says you caught a local shower that missed the rest of us." Silas shook his head. "The rain doesn't pick favorites, Roy, but the soil does. My grandfather's journal warned me that the fat years are a mask. We've had 20 years of perfect weather, and it made everyone believe that we had mastered nature. We haven't. We just forgot that nature always collects its debts." By August, the numbers were in, and they were devastating for Black Hawk County. The average corn yield was down 60%. Some farms had lost everything, their fields reduced to stubble and dust. The grain elevator, which usually hummed with activity, was half empty. Farmers who had expanded aggressively in the 1970s were now receiving acceleration notices from the bank, demanding full repayment of loans they couldn't possibly cover with a failed crop. But when Silas Thorne drove his 1958 truck onto the scale at the elevator, the operator, a man who had laughed at the seed hunter for 5 years, could only stare in disbelief. "Blue flint," the operator muttered, looking at the dark, heavy kernels. "And beans. Silas, I haven't seen grain like this since I was a boy." "It's an old variety," Silas said. "It doesn't yield like a hybrid in a good year, but it produces a crop in a bad one." "A crop?" The operator laughed, but it was a laugh of wonder, not mockery. "Silas, the feedlots in Texas are desperate for anything with protein. They're paying $3.20 a bushel for sorghum, and they'll pay even more for these beans. You're the only farmer in this county who's bringing in a full load today." The news spread faster than the blight had. Silas Thorne, the man with the dead ground and the medieval seeds, had made money when everyone else was losing their shirts. He had no debt to the bank, no fuel bills he couldn't pay, and no chemical loans hanging over his head. As the sun set on the harvest of 1980, Silas sat on his porch and looked at his western slope. The iron pod beans had been harvested, and their residues were already being pulled back into the earth by the earthworms he had nurtured. He thought of Professor Reed and his genetic fossils. He thought of Arthur Vance and his high-yield dreams. But mostly, he thought of the iron cellar and the leather-bound journal. His grandfather had reached across 35 years to save the family farm, not with money, but with a handful of purple beans and the patience to wait for the world to prove him right. The seed hunter had found the only thing that could survive the crash, the truth of the land itself. By the spring of 1981, the crisis in Black Hawk County wasn't finishing, it was just finding its second wind. The perfect world of high-yield dreams had dissolved into a nightmare of foreclosure signs and empty farmhouses. Across the Midwest, the statistics were staggering. Land values in Iowa dropped 63% from their peak, and more than 300,000 American farms were on the brink of vanishing forever. In the local diners and church basements, the talk was no longer about new trucks or expanding acreage. It was about survival. Silas Thorne didn't go to the diners much anymore. He didn't have to. The world started coming to his kitchen table. The mocking nickname, the Seed Hunter, had undergone a transformation. The smirk that usually accompanied it was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of men who realized they had bet their families' futures on a system that didn't love them back. Arthur Vance, the man who once sold progress by the bag, was one of the first to arrive. His co-op was struggling, and his showroom of shiny green iron was full of repossessions that nobody could afford to buy. He sat in Silas's kitchen, staring at a bowl of iron pod beans like they were holy relics. "I called you a fool, Silas," Arthur said, his voice thick with the weight of the farms he'd seen fail. "I told everyone you were living in the past. I said those seeds were fossils." "You weren't the only one, Arthur," Silas replied, pouring a cup of coffee. "Most people don't believe a disaster is coming until they're standing in the middle of it. My grandfather knew that. He said to plant for the drought before it comes, because after is too late." "Teach me," Arthur whispered. "Not for me, I'm done. But for the boys who are still left. Tell them about the roots. Tell them about the soil." And so, the medieval wall of Silas Thorne's farm became a classroom. For the next decade, Silas shared the seed hunter's legacy with anyone willing to listen. He taught them that heart-jong seeds are not just a commodity, but 1,000 years of biological intelligence compressed into a tiny shell. He showed them how iron pod beans and blue flint corn could thrive without a single drop of expensive synthetic nitrogen, because they had the courage to work together. He explained that the factory floor approach to farming was a trap, and that the most advanced technology on Earth was the invisible, teeming life within a healthy clod of dirt. He warned them that the most dangerous words in farming are, "We've always done it this way." By 1992, the transformation of the Thorne farm was complete. The 40 acres of dead ground that Silas had bought for $185 an acre was now some of the most productive land in the county. While his neighbors had spent decades mining their soil and accumulating debt, Silas had spent his time building biology and equity. His organic matter levels had reached 5%, matching the virgin prairie soil that had once greeted the pioneers. Silas died in 2001 at the age of 72. His funeral was a quiet affair at the local church, but the parking lot was full of trucks from 3 different states. There were young farmers there who had never met Silas but were planting his seeds. There were scientists who had once called his methods unscientific but were now writing textbooks about regenerative agriculture based on his results. His daughter Sarah, who had grown up watching her father being laughed at, gave the final word. She held up a small burlap bag, the same kind Silas had carried into the co-op back in 1974. "My father always said that the land was never the problem. The debt and the lack of patience were," Sarah told the crowd. "He didn't just hunt for seeds, he hunted for the truth of how things actually work when you stop trying to cheat nature. He believed that helping your neighbor was more important than getting ahead, and he proved that the old ways aren't always wrong sometimes. They're the only ways that work." Today, the Thorne farm is run by Silas's grandson, Michael. The iron pod beans and blue flint corn are still there, standing tall against the Iowa wind. They don't use much chemical fertilizer, and they don't buy the latest hybrids every spring. They don't have to. Their seeds remember the drought, their soil remembers the rain, and their family remembers the man who was wise enough to be called a fool. Every spring, before the planting begins, Michael descends the stone steps to the iron cellar. He opens the leather-bound journal and reads the words that have saved his family twice. The drought will come again. It always does. Plant the seeds that remember the history of the land before the land forgets you, because after is too late. The story of the seed hunter is a story of patience and bin doi, transformation. It is the proof that the most valuable thing on a farm isn't the horsepower in the tractor or the balance in the bank account. It is the wisdom passed down from those who paid for it in sweat and tears. It is the knowledge that when everyone else is planting for a sprint, the man who plants for a marathon is the only one who will still be standing when the music finally stops.